Thanks, Brian. I know just enough people in this group that anyone here can call bull if I am not speaking truth. And so I welcome you to do that. Today, I don't really plan to talk a lot about Bountiful's wonderful success and how we're doing everything right, but more about some of the things we've learned along the journey and some general principles of risk management that I think would be applicable to all of our organizations. I'm going to share this picture with those online. Hopefully this works. Start by sharing a couple of stories. We have bad days. All of us in our organizations have bad days. Now, if you can't see what this is, that is a 14-year-old on top of one of our transmission lines. That is not an employee. I was sent this picture almost a year ago today from our power director. And apparently this 14-year-old just decided that he was going to bear hug up the tree, up the power pole, go between the two transmission lines and sit on top. Neighbors called, said there's a kid sitting on top of your transmission line. And so we had to go shut down the feeder, shut down one of our substations, bring in the bucket truck, bring him down off the line. And when they asked him, why in the world did you do this? He just said, I just kind of wanted to see what the view was like from up there. No concept at all that had he reached out to his right or his left, he would have died instantly. So some days things just happen. We're in the business of providing services and we can't control always what happens. All right, I'm going to stop that for a minute. Second story. I want to tell you about an employee who had a bad day at Bountiful City about 6 years ago. This was a new part-time employee at our golf course. And Bountiful provides a variety of different services, one of which is a golf course. And so this was a seasonal employee. It was his first week. Keenan, I can't remember. I think you were there when this happened. It was his first week. And he was out working along the fairway on the number one hole when he got hit by a golf ball. Somebody driving off of, and he got hit in the head by the golf ball. So it was a really effective strike. So we have a process and a policy for what happens when there's an injury. He got hit hard enough that he got a concussion. He was nauseous. So we took him per our policy and practice to the emergency room, and we had him checked out. Also consistent with our policy, he had to do a drug test. Guess what? He had drugs in his system and he got fired. So on the same day, he got hit by a golf ball in the head and he got fired. That's a bad day, right, for most people. My point of that story is to illustrate that we can't control always things that happen to us as we're providing services. But if we have good policies, we can prevent worse things from happening. You would say it's accidental that this young man we found out, but it really was not accidental that we found out that he was using illegal drugs. It was because of the policies we had in place. Now, was it his fault he got hit by a golf ball? No. Was it divine intervention? Maybe. But we had those policies in place and a culture of accountability to follow those policies that helped us prevent potentially a bigger problem down the road with this employee. So for the benefit of everybody in the group, I want to take just a minute and I'll try and repeat it online for everybody. I'd like to get a better understanding of what services we are all here in, what services as a group we're providing. Bountiful City has a police department, we have a power department, water department, parks and recreation. We belong to a fire district. You're going to hear from one of the employees of our fire district a little bit later today, Casey. We provide snow plowing. Just by a show of hands in this room, how many of you here are representing cities? Okay, maybe about 2 dozen. For those that are not representing cities, I'd like you just to kind of shout out, who are you here representing? What kind of service district or organization are you here? So just for the benefit of everybody. Okay, with sewer district? Water district?
Landfills.
Okay, landfills, Bountiful has a landfill. Irrigation district? Water, okay. Who else? Any others?
County.
Okay, we've got some county folks, great. Bountiful residents too. So we really run the gamut of services when you think about everything that we provide. Municipalities, some municipalities like Salt Lake provide airport services. Salt Lake International Airport is a municipal service. So with that in mind, I'd like you to think about the services you provide. Now take just a minute and think about, I'd like everyone to think about a risk posed to your employees by the service that you provide. Okay, that's A. Think for just a minute, think of your service and think of a risk that is posed to your employees by providing that service. B, I'd like you then to think for a minute about a risk posed to your residents or your users by the service that you provide. Okay. So a couple of examples. I'd like somebody to share the service they provide and a risk that either your employee or your user or public runs into as a result, the direct result of that service. Some examples? Okay, back here.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so for those online, sewer district, you've got employees that are exposed to disease. I would say chemicals potentially too. I mean, there's a big variety of issues, right? Residents, they're exposed to backups and so which exposes your organization to liability to potential. You know, in West Point, when I worked for West Point City before Bountiful, we had 3 lift stations. We hate lift stations because the liability is so great. 10, yeah, aren't they awful? Thank heavens for gravity. Boy, if you don't have a lift station, you're in a happy place. Okay, another service and risks.
Provide power, obviously, electrocution or severe burn.
Okay, power, death from electrocution or severe burns. We're going to talk about a couple of bad power experiences in Bountiful a little bit later. Okay, so.
Sorry, Jeff. Oh, you go for it. York Valley Thunder.
Yeah.
Water, we're putting employees in trenches. Fixing things.
I'm glad you raised that.
Residents.
Okay, so water, we're putting employees in trenches constantly, frequently in very bad weather, in top of being in trenches. You're talking about, it seems like I hardly knew in West Point when I was there of a Christmas Eve or a New Year's Eve when we weren't fixing a main. Okay, I'm hearing chuckles because I think many of us can appreciate that, right? What a tough job at times. Jeff?
Well, I was just gonna go with the flooding, whether it be fixing something like in a trench, working in a vault, potential if you don't shut things down right or something, the flood potential, the same with residents.
Okay, flood potential from, again, major liability issues potentially from floods. A Bountiful City has, I always forget this number because it's so high. In our water system, because of the unique nature of where we're at, we have, I think, 70 pressure reducing valves. I think the next closest water system in the state has something like 15. It's just a really potentially challenging situation. If one of those fails, we have downstream a lot of potential catastrophic issues with our neighbors, with our residents. If you think about any of the other services that we provide, we're surrounded by risk. Okay? Either our employees, those people that we serve. How many people here have had a claim from a trip and fall on a sidewalk? Many. you know, so there's a variety of different risks, and I hate to sound pessimistic, but in our business, we are really exposed to almost limitless and infinite risk. Sounds terrible, right? And I wouldn't say that I'm a pessimist. I heard a great definition yesterday of a pessimist, which is, and I'm looking at you, Dwayne. A pessimist is just an optimist who has more information. So in this room, we have a lot of optimistic people who have a lot of information. I wouldn't call us pessimists. But in our line of work, we have to be very aware. And I think for many of us, it really is the air that we breathe. We're so familiar with risks in the provision of services that it hopefully is a part of everything that we do. We're thinking about it, but it doesn't mean we have to be paralyzed by risk. So the bad news is, yeah, risk is almost infinite in what we do. But the good news is we don't have to worry about every aspect of risk. And today, for purposes of our conversation, I don't want to talk about what I would consider to be acceptable risk, either acceptable because it's legally acceptable. We take on a certain amount of legal acceptability, or because it's so unlikely to occur. I want to spend a little bit more time thinking as a group about what I would call the unacceptable risks that we really have to manage and mitigate: injury, liability, and then a third, as I thought about this, that was touched on a little bit at the end of the last presentation, is damage to our reputation, or what I would say moral authority to do the right thing. That'll make more sense maybe towards the end of my presentation, but those are the three risks that I kind of want to talk about, developing a culture to mitigate. So there are 4 points today that I kind of want to touch upon as a group, and those 4 would be developing a culture of responsibility and trust. The second, identifying gaps in responsibilities. The third would be creating redundancy as organizations. And then third, developing a willingness to do the hard things, make the hard choices. So going back to a culture of responsibility and trust, a number of years ago, I was in a conference, I think with the League of Cities and Towns, and we had a pilot from the Blue Angels come and speak to the group. And for those who may not be familiar with the Blue Angels, this is the Navy's version of what we enjoy at Hill Air Force Base of now the name's totally escaping me. Who are the F-16 stunt pilots? Thunderbirds, thanks, the Thunderbirds. So the Blue Angels fly, I think, F-18 Hornets, and this pilot came in to talk a little bit about their experience of very high risk maneuvers that they perform. And you're talking about hundreds of miles an hour with these planes being within 18 inches of each other, sometimes inverted. And he explained that after every single flight, they have a debrief that they perform, and the key to that debrief is, and they have a variety of people that pilots have of experience and rank that perform in the Blue Angels. Said after every flight, they have a debrief, they go into a room, and the first thing they do is they all take off their rank insignia. They purposely do it, put it on the table. What's the message of that? What do you think he was trying to get across? When it comes to risk, we are all equal. Everybody shares responsibility. In Bountiful City, we spend a lot of time with our management team developing a culture, I hope, of trust and responsibility. We enjoy one another. We spend time together outside of work when we can. That's not always possible for every organization, but it's important for me that with the management of Bountiful City that we know one another, we enjoy one another, and we have a culture where we can share without shame or blame the good things that are happening and the bad things that are happening. Because what that has done for us is it's engendered a situation where when a mistake is made, our first reaction isn't to point fingers, it's to support and then understand. And so I would say for Bountiful, that's one of the very first and most important things that we have tried to develop is this idea of rank doesn't matter when we're talking about risk or we're talking about the provision of services. We want the ability to be able to share openly and honestly what we do well and what we don't do well. The flip side of that coin is accountability, and I'll talk about that on my fourth bullet point. An example of this is we had, I want to say about 4 years ago, we had an accident in our power department. We had one of our substation technicians who had worked for the city at that point, I think 30 years, get into a box, and he was a little lackadaisical, one of those two words, one of which might not be a word actually. He was a little lazy, we'll put it that way. And he didn't take every single step that he needed to make sure that the portion of the transformer he was working on in the substation was depowered. And the particular piece he was working on, which he'd done hundreds of times, was depowered, but not the portion of the box next to him. And he leaned against it and he created an arc from his shoulder to his wrist. And we have video of this, and it's very scary to watch a person being electrocuted. He didn't die, fortunately, and was able to extract himself. But sorry, I'm getting a little emotional just thinking about it. It's hard to watch that happen. And he was taken to the hospital. He had some pretty severe burns on his arms, fully recovered, but that was a really scary situation for the department. Immediately after that, we have a risk manager in the power department, but after everything was said and done, I shouldn't say immediately after that, within a couple of days, there was a all hands on deck department meeting where they essentially sat around a table, took off their ranks, and discussed what happened, why it happened, and what needed to be done to prevent it from happening again. That was a great example for me of a culture of responsibility and accountability. And the focus was not on blaming anybody, it was understanding what happened to make sure that nobody else was hurt in the future. So developing these after incident, so I'd say there are 2 points here that I'm trying to make on this bullet point. The first is make sure that in your organizations you've got the right people and the right culture that you can be honest and open with each other. And the second one is develop a standard of after incident reporting and conversations. Like the Blue Angels, they don't do it just when there's a bad thing that happens. They do it after every single flight. Now that may not be practical with our kinds of services, but I think it is a good practice if we can find a way to do it, to develop a habit of doing after incident reports so that it becomes natural and normal. Kind of going back down to jumping ahead a little bit to the accountability piece I want to talk about. If the only time you talk to an employee is when something has gone wrong, we all know how well that goes. It doesn't really develop a great sense of trust in the organization. And if the only time you're talking about problems is when a problem has occurred, it's going to be a lot harder to develop that trust and accountability. People will freeze up. They'll be less likely to share. So the degree to which we can, when we're thinking of risk management, talk about scenarios and do training and make evaluations of our performance a regular portion of what we do, not just when there is a problem, the better able we will be to be open and honest with each other. The second point I'd like to talk about is identifying gaps of responsibility. In 2009, I had to look it up to see the date. It was November 4th, and I remember the weekend because I was commuting back and forth between, for that week, some training in Salt Lake between West Point and Salt Lake City. And I remember this very vividly. In On November 4th, 2009, there was a refinery explosion in Woods Cross, Silver Eagle Refinery. Just by a quick show of hands, does anybody remember this? Okay, a good portion of the people here remember this happening. I remember thinking about it because it happened shortly after my commute, and the next day I thought, really happy I was not there. This refinery is just next to I-15. There was a 10-inch gas line that failed, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. It resulted in an explosion that damaged over 100 homes in the surrounding neighborhood, moving one off of its foundation. 4 employees were injured, no one seriously. Just 2 or 3 minutes before, a person was inspecting a line right next to that line and was fortunate to not be in the vicinity. So it certainly could have been a lot worse. I mean, and how many times have we said that to ourselves as risk managers? Well, that could have been worse. This was one of those cases, fortunately. But a lot of damage, millions of dollars in damage, a lot of disruption to residents. And the city manager of Woods Cross kind of shared some of the lessons learned. As a result of that explosion, the community was concerned. It was the second time they'd had a fire or an explosion in that facility in the same year. One happened in January. And so the residents started talking about doing things like requiring the refinery to build a wall high enough that it could contain an explosion, which is a great idea if you think about it. Let's just send it all straight up. And not practical. Or better yet, having the city build a wall around the refinery at taxpayers' expense. A lot of things were brought out, but the city manager was very involved with the refinery about what happened and why, and it took several years to find out. The result, what caused, as I mentioned, what caused that explosion, it was a 10-inch pipeline that had corroded to the point that it was so thin that it started to leak, and then there was an ignition source, and it created this explosion. The unique thing about that 10-inch line was there was no record of inspection on that in its lifetime. And not only was there no record, they specifically could tell it had never been inspected. Now that feels and sounds negligent, right? But here's the reason why. And as they got into it, they understood they had great policies. They had great inspection protocol, they believed. And there was one section of the refinery that I believe was storage, and another section that was the refinery operation, the refining operation. This gas line was between those two. They had an inspector who was responsible for this portion, and they had an inspector who was responsible for this portion. Neither one of them took responsibility for inspecting the link between the two. And so as we consider risk management, I think we need to be thinking about those areas where we may have a lack of overlap, where we may have gaps in accountabilities because we're so focused on our own responsibility that we're not thinking of the big picture. In that regard, that's how this bullet point in my mind ties back to developing a culture of responsibility and trust. When you have that, everyone looks out for everyone else. There is much less of a tendency to say, well, that's your problem and I'm not going to worry about it. We have more of a tendency to say, how can I help you? What are you doing? Or if you see something, the ability to step up to another department head or another function and say, you might not be aware of this, without risk of feeling like you're going to be offending somebody or stepping on toes. It was interesting. It was great to talk about and hear about police departments, and a lot of those things resonated with me with our police department. My chief will be able to tell you, Ed Beeler will be able to tell you that one of the pet peeves that I have of our police department was that they would refer to the police department and the city. And I had to remind them, we're all on the same team. And I don't think that they did that out of any kind of maliciousness or lack of identity. It was just they're in their own building. Police departments tend to have their own culture. When you're physically separated and when your functions are separated, it seems like there is a tendency to separate yourself from the roles and responsibilities of the broader organization. And so when I would hear that, well, we've got to get permission from the city, or I'm going to talk to the city about that, it really bothered me, because we all are part of the same organization. So I think a risk factor that you may want to look and identify is, are there areas in your departments, in your organizations, where there is siloing, or where there is a feeling of us versus them? And what can you do as managers or risk managers to develop overlap and trust, so that you don't have a lack of watching out for each other's back, or a lack of accountability between departments or functions? Item number 3, create redundancy. So another interesting aspect of this Silver Eagle refinery explosion after the fact was a theory of risk management that they were trying to institute. And this may not be new for some, but if you look at risk, if you compare it to, say, a bullet, a gun, and shooting a target, and you have your greatest amount of risk, or it's easiest to hit that risk target if there's nothing between the gun and the target. But if you're able to place, say, a still barrier with a single hole through it, it's much harder for that bullet to pass through and hit the target. Now, if you take that still barrier and you spin it so that you have to time firing that bullet through that hole while it's spinning, you're going to reduce the likelihood of hitting that target even more. If you then can put another still trap behind that is also spinning, you've now dramatically reduced again the likelihood that you are going to have an incident, because you've now got to hit 2 small holes, both of which are spinning, before you get to the target. And you can kind of see the philosophy there. It's this idea of redundancy. Redundancy is something that, to me, I need to be finished here. Okay, good. Bring up another picture and try and share this. One of the things I really enjoy doing on a personal level is I like canyoneering. I like rappelling, something I got into just a few years ago. This is a picture of my friend Roger in Arches National Park, and there are a few things that I do to make sure that we're safe. There's a lot of risk inherent with rappelling and canyoneering. When you think about it, I mean, I think almost all of us appreciate the height, and it's not the height that kills you, it's the landing that kills you. But to avoid that fall, there are a lot of things that you do to minimize the risk so that you can enjoy the rewards. One of which, if you can kind of look to the right side of that picture, you can see that there's what they call webbing and an anchor to the rock. I'm not a big risk taker, so I like to go to routes like this one where the anchors are already set. I'm not building my own. And what you look for is 2 anchors, and then a system to tie both those anchors together with webbing, so that if one anchor happens to come out of the rock, you're not going to die, right? You've got a second anchor that's going to hold you onto the rock. I always bring a second rope. I've been in situations where a rope gets tied, fortunately we're able to fix it, but when you're pulling your rope back through at the bottom of a rappel, let's say you're on a route where you've got 5 or 6 different rappels to get to the end, and you've done 2, you're in the middle of this slot canyon. If you've only got 1 rope and that rope gets hung up, you're in a lot of trouble. So we always bring 2 ropes. As far as your personal gear is concerned, you're wearing a harness and what they call a belay device, which attaches the rope to your harness. And I like redundancy there. I like to have a backup system so that if one loop of my harness fails, there's another loop that's going to catch that. And then On top of that, what you can't see in this picture is that below my friend Roger here at the bottom of this cliff is somebody who's what we call en belay, holding on to the bottom of the rope so that if he falls, you can simply pull the rope and stop his fall. These are a lot of these redundancy measures that you put in place to maintain safety. The challenge comes when you are the first person down the rope. There's nobody at the bottom to provide redundancy on belay for you. So you have to take additional measures. I didn't bring it up, and I'm going to grab it right now. So keep in mind that a rope on rappelling, this 8mm rope that we usually double strand it so you can pull it back through when you're done. But by itself, it's strong enough to hold a 1-ton truck easily. They're very, very strong. They're very resilient. But when you don't have somebody on belay, if for something, let's say something happened, a rock hits you, you lose consciousness, your hands come off the rope, it's very easy to potentially fall and slide down the end of the rope. The number one cause of death nationwide in situations like this is actually coming off the end of your rope. And so what I like to practice when we go down is I use what we call an auto block. And I don't know if you can see this very well online or in the back of the room, but it's a very small cord tied in a loop that you attach to your harness, from your harness to your rope underneath your belay device that acts basically as an automatic brake. If your hands come off, this will tighten around the rope and will stop you. It takes a little bit of extra time to put on. It doesn't allow you to do the really fun, cool things like these big swinging rappels, and bouncing off the wall. You have to go a little bit slower. So not everybody uses them. So my friend Roger and I and a couple of other people were in Snow Canyon 2 years ago doing a route at, I think it's Hamblin Arch, Johnson Arch. It's Johnson Arch for those of you who know it at Snow Canyon. You can hike up to it at the bottom. It's a 200-foot rappel. Roger was the first one over. I was with his 14-year-old son on top and a couple of other friends. And it's a bit of an awkward entry off of a boulder down the side of this this canyon, and kind of have to hoist yourself over, and your handholds can be on your rope, and your belay device can be a little awkward. Long story short, I'm standing next to him. I watch him go over, and I hear him yell, "Whoa, whoa!" And he's gone. He just slid down the rope. 200 feet, that fast. His 14-year-old son standing next to me watching his dad slide down this rope. Sorry, again, this is one of those things that you don't, isn't necessarily fun to think about watching. Roger had one of these. At the last minute, he was able to move his hands in such a way that this saved his life. This very small cord stopped him to the point that his feet he was able to dangle and touch the ground, but this arrested him, it stopped him. Of course, we didn't know that at the time. My thought standing at the top of the cliff was I've got a best friend who's died and his son's watched it. And quickly pulled Josh away from the side and looked over and saw Roger at the end of the rope, fortunately not on the ground, dangling. And we all were very grateful that we had taken the extra time to went on other rappels that day, and we hadn't necessarily to attach this very simple auto block device and redundancy. I don't want to show up hands or anything like that, but I would imagine that many of us have had experiences in our jobs where we have had situations where people have been injured, hopefully not died in critical incidents because they didn't take that extra step of redundancy. And it's some of this developing this culture of redundancy is, I should say, this habit of redundancy is cultural. You have to be willing to have a situation where an employee feel safe enough to call out an employee for not doing it. If you're in the trench and you haven't shored up the trench because you're in a hurry, because it's Christmas Eve and it's freezing cold and you want to get done with that water main replacement before it gets dark and get back to your family, and you don't want to take the extra half an hour to put in the shoring device. If you don't have a culture where the lowest person on the totem pole can call out the department head and say that needs to be done, then you're going to risk situations where someone may die, someone may be injured. As a result of our experience with this, Josh, who we typically, this is the 14-year-old son, who we typically go rappelling with, he's very, very willing to call any of us out if we're not doing something safe. And we've developed a mantra, which is confident, never casual. Anybody we go rappelling with, we try to instill in each other, we want to be practiced enough and skilled enough that we're confident in what we're doing, but we're never casual about it, even on small rappels, because it doesn't take a lot. And the same principles can apply to work. There's so many things that we do that are routine that can become casual. But if we have some redundancy and a culture in place that will help prevent those things, we can avoid some of the catastrophic problems that we see that affect people's lives so dramatically. In our own water department, let me share a couple of work examples of this. Again, in the power department, a very routine practice that we have is replacing meters on homes. And there are a lot of steps that we take to protect our employees and the public when we're doing this, but it's very routine. You know, some of the procedures that we take, for example, are you wear clothing that is non-conductive. You don't wear clothing underneath that clothing that if there is an arc flash that will melt onto your skin or burn. You wear eye protection. So we had a situation with an employee, longtime employee, 30 years, that he was replacing a meter. Unbeknownst to him, the wiring was it was incorrectly wired. It was a new meter. He took the old meter off, put the new meter on, and the meter exploded. He had eye protection, but he didn't have a face shield. He got burned on his face. Full recovery, fortunately. But since that time, we have now implemented that additional sort of measure of when he replaces meters, he wears a full face shield. Those are the kinds of redundancies that if we make habit, we can avoid having problems with. A second idea of this redundancy is blue staking. Who here has actually done blue staking as part of your job? Okay, we got a few. Dustin, you did blue staking?
Long time ago.
Okay, and an ideal situation, what are some of the redundant steps with blue staking that are going to avoid a problem?
That I had somebody else to check.
Okay, so somebody else to check your work. Good. Anything else? And by a problem here, I'm talking about maybe puncturing a high pressure gas line or a water line, or I remember the good old days in West Point with Davis Weaver when we had a contractor that was potholing and hit an irrigation line that ripped out an entire intersection. I mean, all those fun things. So what are some other steps for those of you that do blue staking that besides having somebody check your work might be useful? What about in the construction of that water line? What are some things that we do? Anybody know? Okay, now we have this marvelous ability to GPS the exact locations. That is one of the challenges of blue staking, right? Is we don't know exactly where that stuff is. It's everywhere. And we try our best. What else can you do? Trace wire. I'm glad somebody brought, that's a big, big thing. How many people here have had situations because there was no trace wire in the blue staking? Well, many of us have. That's a bad day, right? That's another bad day when you're digging and there's no trace wire and the blue staking is in the right place. So again, it's a variety of these things. What are you going to say?
And hand dig. Just put the hand dig below the
Hand dig. How many of us have had issues with not having had a contractor or someone else not hand dig, even after it's been blue staked? Yeah, I got out of church one day because that happened. High powered gas line went off, was ruptured right next to the church, and they had to come evacuate us. Casey, were you on that one? Telling everybody to get out of the building and stop talking. These are just examples of redundancies that we can put in place that to be aware of. The last one I want to talk about, I've only got just a couple of minutes, is this idea of doing the hard things. And this relates, I think, very much to what Greg was talking about earlier with culture in our departments. If we are unwilling to hold people accountable to, then we're perpetuating a cultural problem that can't be solved. We had a situation at our golf department a few years ago where we became aware of some harassment. We have a lot of young ladies who prepare the carts and send golfers out. We were very fortunate. We had one of them who was very brave and raised the issue that we had a couple of longtime employees of the golf course who were saying inappropriate things, acting in inappropriate ways, making uncomfortable. We don't know how long that had been going on. It could have been years. And unfortunately, none of it had been reported until one young lady was brave enough to bring it forward. And she was believed. That's another part of this is, and it was hard. It was very hard for some of the leadership at our golf course to take the word of a part-time 17-year-old girl over a 75-year-old 30-year employee. But as we started to investigate and dig, we realized that it didn't take very long to realize that there had been a pattern of behavior that was very unfortunate. And it was uncomfortable interviewing these people. We fired 3 people as a result of this, longtime employees. They all had good excuses. Wow, I didn't mean it that way. People take things too seriously, et cetera, et cetera. But unless your organization is willing to hold bad pennies accountable and not pass them on, you don't have the moral authority to make the changes that you need to. I think we're all familiar with stories, and we've heard about some of them today in police departments where bad actors, but because we aren't consistently recording behavior and holding people accountable, sometimes in uncomfortable situations, when another situation comes up, you don't have the moral authority anymore to call somebody out on it. You become, to a degree, complicit. And so holding one another accountable appropriately when there is bad actions taking place is so important to minimizing risk. And I would be curious to see nationwide how many of the large claims that we have for bad actors among our employees, particularly when they're dealing with public and public safety, could have been avoided had that person been dealt with early on in their career, as opposed to perpetuating a problem and tolerating it for whatever reason. But as a leader, if you're not willing to do that, you can't expect anyone else in the department or in your organization to do that. With that, maybe I'll reiterate something Greg said that really struck a chord with me, which is policies can never overcome poor leadership and culture. I'd say the biggest thing that I'm grateful for and bountiful is we are working hard, not perfectly, and you're going to hear that later today, to develop a culture that has redundancy, that has accountability, that has we're all in it together attitude. And those things, more than anything, can overcome the deficiencies that you might have in policies or the inevitable bad day when a golf ball hits your temp employee on the head. Thanks for your time, and appreciate the conference.